Hello and welcome to Unit 2 of MBA 6113 Change Management. This week we'll discuss the nature of organizational change as well as the types of change that an organization might experience. We'll also discuss the dimensions of change as well as some of the phases of organizational growth and change and development as a company moves throughout its organizational life cycle, because we know that these different phases bring about different challenges, particularly when it comes to implementing change initiatives. So those are all the topics we'll be discussing this week. So first, let's start with the types of change. Now, when we talk about change management, we think to ourselves automatically, well, we don't know. Change is unpredictable. We don't know what an organization is going to experience in terms of changes in the market, changes within the organization, internal changes. And so how can we predict the types of change or some of the problems that we're going to face as an organization? We think to ourselves, well, it's impossible to try to predict change. And while that's partly true, we can be certain that change is inevitable. Every organization at some point or another is going to experience change, both internal and external change in the market, change in the industry, change in the type of competition that an organization might be experiencing, change within the organization and how it's managed and how it's operated. So we can be confident that change is inevitable. It's going to happen. And for the most part, when we look at change strategically from an organizational perspective, not down at the micro level, when we're not looking at very specific changes to an individual organization, but rather when we talk about change as a large kind of collective group of events, we can really start to categorize change according to types of change that an organization might experience. Whereas if we look at the micro level and we pick out a specific organization, we say, well, that organization experienced change because perhaps a couple of members of the board of directors came in and were upset with the CEO, and so they fired the CEO and they hired a new CEO who didn't have the skill set required to manage that company, and he did a whole bunch of things that didn't work well with the organization collapsed. We can point to that and say, well, there was a specific change that hurt the company. Well, while that's true at the micro level, when we look at that one case, that's not something that's entirely uncommon. We can actually start to classify or categorize types of change according to kind of these broad categories: internal changes versus external changes, convergent versus radical change. Is it something that's industry related versus internal management related? So we can actually begin to develop these kind of dimensions of change when we talk about new initiatives and these other change factors. We can actually start to kind of categorize and classify types of change and how they fit into our organizational strategy. The interesting thing about change, and particularly when we start talking about change management, we see a significant number of direct parallels between change and innovation. Now, some of you might have already had the course in managing innovation, so some of this might sound familiar. If you haven't, that's okay too, because you might have seen a discussion or heard a discussion in one of your other courses about innovation. If not, you've probably seen it in a discussion of innovation and the importance of innovation to businesses today and operating today because of technology and the change, constant change out there in the industry. So you don't have to necessarily be completely fluent in innovation to understand that we basically kind of experience two types of innovation when we're talking about externally out there in the marketplace. We can be looking at incremental or sustaining innovations, those small innovations that occur periodically that kind of serve to evolve a particular type of product or service or process within our company. How we do business is constantly changing and it's evolving and getting hopefully better. And so we have these incremental changes, these small sustaining changes that allow our product or service or our company to continue to operate efficiently and competitively. Then we also experience radical or disruptive change, where all of a sudden either a new type of product or service or process is introduced in the industry that completely takes our world of how we do business and kind of flips it upside down, turns it on its head, and all of a sudden we're having to operate differently and do things differently. An example would be the e-publishing, electronic ebooks, and what that did for the publishing industry. Downloadable music and MP3s and MP4s and iTunes for the music industry. Those are all examples of disruptive or radical innovations that have have caused industries and companies to have to change the way they do business or face extinction. So we do see a lot of direct parallels between innovation and change. Innovation typically brings about change. Obviously, something an organization wants to do is to pursue innovation, is to constantly be pursuing new and innovative ways to operate and be competitive. As part of that is kind of a parallel or something that comes along with that would be organizations have to be able to manage change, because if we're going to be innovative, that means we're going to have to change constantly and continually. Well, we've got to be able to manage change. So we do see these direct parallels between change and innovation. So you can kind of, when we start talking about the types of change, you can kind of associate these certain types of change, the scope of change, convergent versus radical, with these types of innovation, incremental or radical or disruptive innovation. They kind of go hand in hand. So when we start looking at implementing change within the organization, we talk about scope and we talk about pace. Those are two very important things that we've got to consider when we're looking at implementing some type of, or effectively implementing some type of change initiative. We've got to think about, okay, what's the scope of this change initiative that we're talking about? Is it more convergent, or is it a radical type of change? Convergent meaning kind of processes and procedures and products kind of converge, and we start to see this gradual evolution of how our organization is changing and operating. We kind of link that to these incremental or sustaining innovations, in that the change might be a little bit smaller, incrementally smaller. We make small changes periodically to slowly evolve the organization and move it in the right direction. Or the scope of the change can be radical. If we're talking about a radical or disruptive innovation, something that is kind of forcing us, causing us to need to change quickly, change drastically to be able to compete. The scope of the change might be radical in that we have to completely redesign the structure, the nature of the organization to be more effective. That's what we kind of mean when we talk about scope. Pace is another item to consider. what is the pace of the change? Is it continuous change? And we think about continuous being, again, more incremental, kind of a gradually sloping upward line in terms of change. And I think your book even has a diagram of kind of continuous change being more of a straight line, a linear model for change, and how you're kind of constantly evolving and you're steadily changing for the better and steadily implementing these new change initiatives in a way that allows your organization to evolve and be more effective. Or is the pace of change more episodic? So does the change occur in episodes? And again, your textbook, I believe, has a diagram, a picture of this kind of wavy line, kind of like sound waves, where you go through a period of intense change, and then you experience a period of no change, and then you experience a period of another radical change, intense change, where you completely do things differently, and then again that levels off and you don't experience as much change. So these are two things to consider: the scope and the pace. If we talk about the scope and pace, we end up with kind of this discussion about, there we go, dimensions, the dimensions of change. We end up kind of creating this diagram that I'll go over here in a moment, which we use to talk about the dimensions of change, because we know we have types of change, the pace of change, scope of change, but also what are the dimensions? In what form does the change actually take place? What either causes it to happen? What form does it happen in? What's the nature of the change? So we basically look at these kind of three different components: the scope, the pace, and then as a direct result of those, the scope and pace, also the dimensions. Well, the dimensions of change, we look at, okay, what's the driver? The dimensions of change are much more specific, rather than simply saying, well, the scope is either radical or incremental or whatever. The pace is either continuous or episodic. The dimensions of change is much more complex. When we start talking about, kind of what are the dimensions within which this change is going to occur, we look at many more variables when we're trying to kind of analyze how this change fits into our overall organizational strategy. First, we've got to be able to assess, what's the driver? What's driving this change? Is it inertia? Well, if it's inertia, then chances are this change is going to be more continuous, more incremental in nature, kind of hopefully help the organization to evolve rather than just radically flip-flop overnight, or is it instability? I mean, is it something that is the industry or the market inherently unstable, so we're going to have to change radically overnight? And let me go back to my example a moment ago when I talked about, radical or disruptive change. Because of the quick and rapid change in technology, when you talked about kind of the publishers, whether it was old school, the music publishing houses, or the actual textbook print media publishing houses, they both share the same type of story. Because of technology and the radical change of technology, being able to purchase your music direct off the internet, download, and all digital content, digital media, and the same being true for textbook publishing, be able to purchase your books directly, digitally, and read them on an e-reader or your tablet or computer or whatever, they had to change very quickly. They were faced, this is something that took place in a very short span of time. When you think about these traditional publishing, whether it's print or music publishing, they had experienced a great run of many years of kind of dominating the market in how they do things within their industry. And then all of a sudden, overnight, because of a small change in technology, they're faced with becoming extinct because they're no longer dominating or controlling the industry. So it was a very radical or disruptive innovation that brought about, kind of necessitated the need for radical change at a very obviously episodic type of pace, because for so long the industry had not changed at all, and then all of a sudden overnight it seems like all of a sudden it's entirely different. The industry is entirely different. So the driver was some kind of inherent instability in the market. All of a sudden they're losing customers left and right, and it's much more challenging to continue to do business. So all of those dimensions of change, the dimension of change, the type of change, the scope, the pace, all of those things should kind of line up, because we find that, as I mentioned early on, that yes, change is something we can't always predict. However, we notice that types of change, the scope of a particular type of change, the pace of that change, the dimensions of the change, they all tend to kind of line up in certain ways. So when we think about change as a broad topic, a big picture strategy component, so a lot of these things make sense. It makes sense that we need to be prepared for radical change that is more episodic in nature, that is driven by instability, that the form of the change could represent some type of replacement, either a replacement for our business model or a replacement for our product or our service. And the nature of that change is either emergent or intended. It might be, in the case we think about, again, going back to the publishing business, for ebooks and book publishing, you think about all of the markets that were affected by traditional print media, newspapers, textbooks, just like novels, fiction and nonfiction, the bookstores, Barnes and Nobles, Borders, all the companies that were engaged in that industry prior to the ability to download your books to your tablet or your Kindle Fire or whatever you have, your iPad, whatever it is or even your phone. Back when there was still a need to print physical copies of books, all of the industries that were affected by that, or all the types of businesses that were involved in that industry. Again, the publishing houses themselves, who their entire business model was built on finding an author. They would send them a manuscript. They would have editors read the manuscript, decide they liked the manuscript, and they wanted to print the book. They wanted to create a book out of it. So they'd give the author a book contract, and they'd print 500,000 copies of this book in hardcover or whatever, and sell it for $30 a book, of which the author would get probably $1 or $2, because the cost to print, and then the publishing house gets to keep so much, and then they'd have to sell it to the retailer, which would be the Barnes and Noble or the Borders bookstore. And so by the time it got to the consumer, it was a $20 or $30 book, of which the author him or herself, got $1 or $2. The same model was true for the music business of artists and musicians and the publishing houses and CDs and music stores, back when there were still music stores. So the same is true for that. So it's a very similar model for both industries. Well, we think about the change and why, we obviously had changes in technology, we had innovation in technology. Well, the nature of the business model, the nature of the dimension of the change that we see now, where authors can go straight to Amazon.com and do straight to self-publishing through independent publishing through Amazon.com. You write a book, you can publish it in ebook format, downloadable to a Kindle, straight through Amazon, and you get to keep half of everything that's sold. You sell your book for $10 or whatever, you get to keep $5 of it. Or if you want to sell your book for $2, $1.99, which is what a lot of ebook publishers, ebook authors do nowadays. There's quite a few of them that are popular. You can write a short book and publish it straight through Amazon for $1.99. You keep $1 and Amazon keeps $1. And you get to make as much money off your book as you would have before, except you don't have to find a publisher who's willing to give you a book contract, print 500,000 copies, and send it to bookstore. You don't have to do that any longer. And the same is true of music. The independent musicians, the indie musicians that sell their work through iTunes, it's the same, kind of the same model. Well, obviously the technology made it possible, the innovation made it possible, but the nature of the change, the nature of the business model we see now is more emergent than anything else. It constantly continues to emerge and to be different, and whether you're using YouTube or a different type of channel to get your message out there, we're seeing more and more emergent type of change than ever before. So again, the dimensions of change, we've got to figure out what's the driver, what's the form, is the nature emergent or is it intended? What's the type of feedback on the change? Is it negative or positive? Because the type of feedback, negative feedback or positive feedback, will absolutely guide and direct the change initiative. What about the connectedness of the system? If we think back to last week in terms of systems thinking, is the system itself very loose or tight in terms of how it's connected, and the interoperation of the organization or the industry for that matter? Is it something that can change quickly, or is it something that's going to take a little more time? So we talk about scope and pace and dimension and all those things together when we start really analyzing change initiatives and how they fit into our overall organizational strategy. And this grid is actually in your reading in the text, but it really helps put, it kind of helps summarize that whole scope and grid and dimension discussion that we just had. You'll see that up here we can again analyze change in terms of the scope of the change. Is it more convergent or is it more radical? Over on this side, we can talk about or look at the pace of the change. Is it more continuous or episodic? So if we're looking at or analyzing radical change that is more continuous, or convergent change that is more continuous, we might see that the driver might be some type of minor system instability. The form of change would be some small adaptation in the network, nature more emergent, positive feedback, and kind of loose connections. So this kind of helps put all of those pieces together that we just mentioned in one place, in kind of one grid, to be able to go in there and say, well, that makes sense. Because again, when we start classifying change at a large scale, kind of a grand perspective, while change might be difficult to predict, it's not too terribly difficult to analyze and understand and try to be prepared for, or try to deal with, or try to implement, or try to manage. Because typically these sources of change, types of change, scope, pace, dimensions of change, they have a tendency to kind of cluster together in ways that make sense. So if we understand the ways in which change occurs, how it occurs, why it occurs, what the problems with managing those different types of change, what we'll probably expect, then we can be better prepared for it. So when we talk about experiencing some type of change event, or some type of need for change to implement within the organization, many times we're dealing with what we call the need for frame breaking, or some type of discontinuous change mechanism. And you probably remember from maybe one of your psychology classes, or maybe one of your sociology classes, you've probably heard of what we call the frame of reference, and how every individual makes decisions according to their own frame of reference. We all see the world through our own frame of reference. If we're standing in a room, or if we're out in the middle of a large plain or pasture or something like that, and we're standing in a building with 4 walls, and one of those walls has a large window on it, and so we can only see out one wall, or out this window, and every one of us, the size and shape and the color of the glass of that window is going to be different. As human beings, as executives, as managers, that window through which we look out and see the world, for every one of us, it's going to be different. And it's going to be different because of what we call our frame of reference. We frame every decision, we frame every move that we make, decision we make, even our own belief system, we frame that through our own, through what we can reference from our experiences and our memories and things that have happened to us in our life, and what we've experienced as managers, as executives, as just people in general. And so it's very much the same. The same is very much true for an organization. An organization has a culture comprised of people and other personnel and resources and whatnot. And we start to see this frame of reference develop within an organization as well. An organization with boards of directors and different levels of management and leadership will also make decisions and pursue strategies very much based upon the frame of reference of the collective, of the organization as a collective. So we do things, and when it comes to change, many times we have to break that frame of reference. We have to be willing to knock down another wall. Going back to my analogy a moment ago, when you're standing out in the middle of a plain or the desert or whatever, in a building with 4 walls, and only one wall has a window when you're looking out. Sometimes we have to be willing to, knock out another wall and to put another window in, to be able to look out 2 windows, or two directions. Or we have to be willing to replace our old window with a new one, which is maybe slightly less convoluted with our previous experiences. So we have to engage in some type of frame-breaking type of change. Well, the need for frame-breaking change, or this discontinuous change that completely ignores or changes or modifies the way we've always done, might come from any different, might stem from any different reason or event. But typically we find that the need for frame-breaking change will stem from something like some type of discontinuity in the industry. Something has changed drastically in the industry. The industry itself is discontinuous, and maybe ups and downs, maybe government regulations, perhaps deregulation of the industry, or perhaps additional regulations of the industry, or perhaps something like what we recently experienced with the in Washington politics with government shutdowns and things like that, where it drastically affects the way you do business. Again, the need for this change might also stem from a shift in the product life cycle. Perhaps the life cycle of our product is no longer 2 years. We can't expect we roll out this new product, and before perhaps we could expect this product to be a piece of our revenue stream for 2 years. Well, now perhaps it's not. Perhaps now we can only expect this particular product or service to have a viable life in the market of 6 months before we have to replace it with something else. Frame breaking, discontinuous change, also the need for that also sometimes stems from organizational dynamics. As the organization itself grows and changes and starts pursuing additional new ventures and other strategies, the dynamics of the organization itself might change. New leadership, for example. Well, frame breaking change there's a few things that have to happen if we're going to break the frame of how we've always done things. First, obviously, we've got to have some type of reformed mission, and we've got to have some type of reformed core values. What are we really about? What are we trying to do? How do we is our mission still in perfect alignment with, or how do we align our mission with our strategies? That's important because we tend to leave our mission and core values alone forever. Organizations tend to, we update policies and procedures, yet we don't update mission and core values. We just leave those alone. Frame breaking change also requires some type of altered power and status structure so that the power and status is not with the same group that it always has been. Will require some type of reorganization of the company as a whole. It'll probably require some modified and new processes, and perhaps even and probably even some new leadership. Because it's very difficult for leaders within an organization to all of a sudden change the way they've always done things. Many times it involves an entirely new group of leadership altogether. And obviously the purpose, what we hope to accomplish with this frame breaking and this discontinuous change is we're trying to seek quick synergy. We're trying to accomplish synergy very quickly. Groups, project teams, an organization as a whole, whatever that is synergistic, pulls together to modify and change and adapt. Frame breaking change, we're hoping to overcome pockets of resistance because we know that if we don't do some of these things, there will be small pockets that will try to resist the change and ultimately kind of self-sabotage. We get into that type of situation where the organization or pockets of resistance within the organization kind of self-sabotage or engage in self-sabotage because they don't want to change. Perhaps we're trying to address some type of long overdue need for change or address some type of riskiness and uncertainty out there in the market that we want to get kind of ahead of the curve and make change before it obviously comes and affects us as an organization. This graphic and the next graphic are kind of the same thing, but there's two different ways to look at it, and I'm going to show you both. This one is actually in your text, but when we think, again, we're still thinking about change from the kind of grand perspective, the large scale perspective of organizational change. We can, very much like what we've done with a product, we talk about the product life cycle, and I'm sure you've probably seen this or heard this over and over again in your classes. Products and services have a life cycle of when of kind of their viable life to an organization. We can roll out a new product tomorrow, and we'll experience the product life cycle. Market introduction, whereas we just introduce it to the market, and not many people know what it is, and we have to create awareness. And then you see market growth when people start finding out that, hey, this is a great product or service, and people start buying it, and we see sales start to increase. So you have market introduction, market growth. You have market maturity, which the market for that product matures. Everybody has one. Nobody else wants one, and other products start replacing it. And then you move into sales decline. And it's very much like you growing up as a person. You have the different phases that we experience as a human being growing. Adolescence, adulthood, and older age, and we kind of decline in our abilities and our health, for that matter. So it very much is true. The same is true of our products. Market introduction, market growth, market maturity, and sales decline. The same can be said of an organization. It has its own life cycle as well. Now, obviously, what we don't want to happen is we don't want the organization to start up like a new startup business, start to grow and then mature and then die and decline. So what you start to see is the structure and the dynamics in the organization change over time. And we kind of go through these stages or phases. We have this, phase 1, 2, 3, 4, or stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. The entrepreneurial stage, the collective stage, the formalization stage, and the elaboration stage. And as the organization grows, we experience these types of crises, leadership crisis, autonomy crisis, control crisis, staff crisis, unknown, and there are additional crises, moving forward. But I'm going to go ahead, and this one again is in your book, but I'm going to pull up this one here, which again has the same overall concept, but it kind of helps clarify a little bit better the life cycle of an organization. As an organization goes from small or kind of an entrepreneurial startup to large, which is what we see over here, the organization grows, obviously. We see all these different growth stages, and then we kind of experience some crisis here, and then we get that crisis resolved, and we grow some more, and then we kind of experience another type of crisis, and then the organization will grow a little bit more, and this continues on and on. As we go through all of these different stages, we can pinpoint pretty much where different companies and organizations will where they are in their organizational life cycle. Organizations obviously start out in the entrepreneurial stage. We see all kinds of creativity. Organizations doing new things, just exciting things, being very creative. And then the organization reaches a point where it starts to experience crisis. And it has a need for leadership, a need for perhaps the founders and the original people involved with the company do a great job here, but then the organization gets to a certain point in size where you need leadership at a much more kind of expansive, maybe more grand scale. And the organization will find that leadership, and then that leadership will provide clear direction, and the organization will grow some more. And then all of a sudden, you start to experience another type of crisis where the organization has a need for delegation. There's this control struggle. Perhaps the individuals leading the organization here have a hard time giving up control. They eventually find a way to handle that, and the organization grows again. Implement some internal systems to allow the organization to delegate control, organization grows again. Then we experience a whole different type of crisis, bureaucracy or red tape. Because of our internal systems that we put into place, to delegate with control, all of a sudden we now start dealing with bureaucracy. So the organization, we figure out a way to deal with that, and we start implementing project teams or, certain departmental teams and get that resolved. And then we end up with the next type of crisis, which is how do we kind of reinvent ourselves? And we can either we can either go this direction where we start streamlining and look at decentralization of management, or we can kind of continue to mature as an organization, or we move into decline. So this graphic really helps explain some of the challenges that we face, especially the change challenges at different phases in the organization lifecycle. You can probably even look at your own organization and the history of your own organization, and you can probably pinpoint, when it was in each one of these stages, when it hit these different levels of crises. You might even be able to pinpoint at each one of these phases right here when there was perhaps a leadership change, different set of executives, or different group of people helping kind of steer the ship or drive the change or the new strategy. We see it all the time. In fact, you can look at some of the organizations that you're familiar with. Look at Facebook. Facebook is kind of here recently been in this mode right here. Started out, obviously small, startup grew very quickly, became incredibly popular, a lot of creativity. The company went public, and for the longest time, there was a kind of an outcry of shareholders after the company went public to find leadership, replace Mark Zuckerberg with a more experienced public company manager, to be able to provide clear direction for the organization. I think they've since kind of worked that out, and obviously Zuckerberg is still there, but they've kind of since worked that out, and now you start to see some direction for the company, and perhaps you're kind of in this phase right here. An exciting company to be watching in the months and weeks ahead will be Twitter. Twitter's going public. I'm sure probably most of you have heard. Twitter's going to go public and have an IPO, just like Facebook did, and so it's going to be interesting to see how all this takes place, how they figure out how to make money, what's their revenue model going to be. So you might experience some of these same types of things, but you can pick out some of the organizations that you are familiar with. Apple, Apple is sitting here right up here right now. Apple, obviously Steve Jobs is no longer with them, and so they're having to figure out, Tim Cook and the group, okay, where are we going? What's going to happen next? Are we going to continue to mature? Are we going to go into decline? Are we going to completely revitalize and change the way we do things? So we can really pinpoint where different organizations are at in their life cycle, and if we do that, then we can more appropriately or accurately prepare for the type of change we're going to need to implement in an organization. How is that going to affect us? How do we prepare for that type of change? So these are the things that we look at when we talk about change management. We try to tie everything together into kind of a broad picture of the organization and start trying to understand some of the challenges, some of the changes that are going to have to be implemented in order for us to remain competitive. So that's all for this week. We'll see everyone next week as we continue forward in the class.